This is my true story. I raised my son alone after his father died. I worked 2 jobs, sold my jewelry, and built a small life just to see him succeed. I wanted him to be proud of where he came from, but success changed him. He stopped calling, stopped visiting, and when he finally came home, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're just a useless old woman." I didn't cry. I just smiled and let him believe it. Because what he didn't know was that I still owned everything that made him powerful. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my stories can reach more people. He said it on a Sunday morning. The house smelled like toast and coffee, the same way it did when he was a child. I had woken up early to cook his favorite breakfast, hoping to remind him of simpler days. He sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. I asked if he was happy and he smirked. "Of course," he said. "Look what I built." Then he laughed, that proud, careless laugh that people get when they forget who helped them stand. A moment later, without even looking at me, he said it. "You're just a useless old woman." The words didn't cut. They sank. I had fed that mouth when it couldn't chew, clothed that body when it was too small to stand, prayed for that life when no one else would. I looked at him and saw a man who had forgotten what he came from. He talked about meetings, deals, investors, money, things that used to mean nothing, but now meant everything to him. He bragged that his company was unstoppable, that he built it all from scratch. I smiled and nodded, pretending to listen. What he didn't remember was the night he came home years ago with his first business idea, terrified and broke. He didn't remember that I sold my husband's old tractor to give him the seed money. He didn't remember that I stayed up, reading through his contracts, correcting his spelling, helping him write his first proposal. He didn't remember that I was the one who drove him to his first client meeting because he didn't own a car. None of it mattered to him anymore. He had grown into someone who thought kindness was weakness and age was uselessness. I poured his coffee slowly, steady hands. Quiet heart. I said nothing. Silence is the best armor when someone believes they've already won. He looked proud, sitting there, talking about his office, his staff, his growth, his future. Every "his" in his sentence came from something I had sacrificed. I smiled and let him keep talking, but inside something clicked. Not anger, not revenge, just awareness. The kind that comes when you finally see someone for who they really are. He didn't thank me when he left. He grabbed his briefcase, adjusted his tie, and walked out without a glance back. I watched him go. My own son, proud of the world he thought he'd built all alone. I didn't call after him. I didn't remind him of the truth. I didn't tell him that the ground beneath his empire still had my name on it. I washed the dishes slowly, each one an echo of the life I had given him. I thought about every night I stayed up worrying while he worked late, every birthday I spent alone so he could chase success. He had built his castle, but the foundation was still mine. He thought I was a useless old woman. That day, I decided to let him believe it. Some lessons don't need to be taught with words. They teach themselves through time. I still remember the first time he said he wanted to start a company. He was young, ambitious, and full of confidence that didn't come from experience, only from excitement. He came to me one evening with papers, plans, and dreams that sounded too big for our small house. He told me he wanted to build something great, something that would make our name known. I looked at him and saw my husband's fire in his eyes, that same stubborn determination that never let him quit. I believed in him more than he believed in himself. He didn't have a single investor, no savings, no office space. Everything he needed I gave. I sold the last piece of my husband's farmland, the one he loved most. The same land where we had planted our first crops after getting married. That land paid for my son's beginning. The lawyer said the paperwork would take time, but I signed everything quickly. My husband's name disappeared from that property, and my son's dream began. The first office he rented was under my name. He didn't have credit history back then, so I became the guarantor. Every light, every computer, every desk inside that small rented room was paid with my savings. I remember painting the walls myself before his first employee arrived. I even cooked lunch for them during their first week. He thanked me then. He used to call me his good luck charm. I kept those words like treasures, not knowing they would fade so soon. He called the money I gave him seed money, but seeds don't grow without the soil that holds them. I was that soil. He grew. I stayed behind. When the company finally got its first client, he came home smiling, holding a contract with my name on the last page as witness. He needed someone to sign for legal validation, and I was there. I didn't know then that my name on those papers meant more than either of us realized. When the business expanded, he told me not to worry about the details. He said he'd take care of everything, but he still used my home address for registration because it was easier. I didn't think much of it. I was proud that he'd built something out of nothing. I used to visit his office sometimes. At first, the employees greeted me warmly. They called me ma'am and offered me tea. But later, as the company grew, the smiles stopped. They didn't recognize me anymore. I had become another visitor, someone to be politely ignored. He stopped talking about the company at home. Everything became confidential, busy, or complicated. I would see him in newspapers, giving interviews, saying things like, "I built this from scratch." I smiled every time, even though I knew the truth. Mothers don't need credit to feel proud. But one day, that pride turned into realization. He hadn't just forgotten where he came from, he wanted to erase it. The more successful he became, the less I existed in his story. The farmland was gone, the savings were gone, but the papers remained. My name, quietly printed under ownership and address, still tied me to everything he thought belonged to him. It wasn't a secret, it was just forgotten. Buried under arrogance and time, he thought he was the founder. He didn't remember who was the foundation. Sometimes I'd look at the old deed folder and think about my husband. He would have been disappointed to see how our son had changed. But I didn't cry over it. I just folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the drawer. I had no intention of taking anything from him. I just knew one day, when truth caught up to him, those signatures would matter. He thought he had built his success on his own. He thought love had no cost. But behind every empire built on pride, there's someone who paid the price quietly. That someone was me. And while he forgot, the world didn't. The law doesn't forget signatures, and time doesn't forget names. I had given him everything. He just didn't realize he never stopped being tied to me, even when he thought he'd outgrown me. After that day, I stopped trying to correct him. I stopped reminding him who helped him start. Silence became easier than arguments. Every time he called, it was only about business, never about me. "I'm busy, Mom," became his favorite sentence. I learned to accept it, at least on the surface. But inside, something in me began to shift. I realized that silence has a power of its own. It doesn't beg, it doesn't explain, it just waits. I decided to wait. Not for him to apologize, but for life to do what it always does. Balance the scale. He stopped visiting the house, said it was too small and too far. He sent gifts instead, boxes with his company logo printed on them, as if that could replace presents. I smiled and placed them neatly in the corner, unopened. He posted pictures online with his new car, his office, his expensive vacations. I saw them all. Not out of jealousy, but because I wanted to remember what pride looks like before it falls. I didn't comment, didn't call, didn't ask questions. I just let him live in the world he'd built, a world without gratitude. When people in town asked how he was doing, I always said the same thing. "He's fine, busy with work." I never said he'd forgotten me. I never said I ate dinner alone most nights. I kept my dignity the same way I kept my silence. Firm and unshaken. People assume revenge is loud, dramatic, full of shouting and anger. It's not. Real revenge is quiet. It grows slowly, hidden, like a seed under the soil, waiting for the right season to rise. I didn't plan anything cruel. I just decided not to protect him from the consequences anymore. I stopped reminding him about deadlines and taxes. I stopped checking his company documents when he dropped them off for me to sign. He still trusted me with his paperwork, because I had been doing it since the beginning. He never read what he signed, never questioned what I added. He called it boring legal stuff, and I let him keep calling it that. I watched him rush through the papers, too confident to care, too proud to read. Every signature he placed became a quiet thread that tied him tighter to me, and he didn't even see it. The silence between us grew into a wall. On birthdays, he sent quick messages that felt like reminders, not love. "Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you're good." I replied with, "Thank you," and nothing more. I no longer tried to remind him that respect isn't something you outgrow. I had given up on changing him. I wanted him to learn on his own. And he would. Time teaches the lessons pride refuses to learn. When my neighbors talked about his company, I listened. They said it was expanding fast, getting new investors, hiring new faces. I nodded, pretending to be proud. But deep down, I knew what he didn't, that expansion without foundation always cracks. He was running faster than truth could catch him, and I was done running after him. At home, I found peace in small things again, tending to my garden, baking bread, reading old letters from my husband. The quiet gave me space to breathe, to think. I realized I didn't need revenge to feel better. I just needed to stop interfering with karma. Life doesn't need help correcting arrogance. It knows how to do that perfectly on its own. Every night before I slept, I would whisper a simple prayer. Not for his failure, but for his understanding. Because I knew failure was coming and I wanted him to survive it long enough to realize who had stood by him all along. People say a mother's love never fades. That's true. Mine didn't fade. It just turned into silence. The kind that watches, waits, and never forgets. He called me useless once. I didn't answer. Because useless things break, I don't. I endure. And endurance has its own quiet way of turning pain into power. I didn't need to speak. I just needed to stay silent long enough for the truth to speak for me. It started a year before his words ever cut me. He had asked me to help him handle some documents, the usual kind of paperwork he didn't care to read. He trusted me completely back then, not because of love, but because he believed I was harmless. He thought of me as someone too old to understand business, too simple to question contracts, too quiet to matter. That worked in my favor. When he brought home the folder filled with renewal papers, tax filings, and ownership updates, I saw something he didn't. An opportunity for protection. Not revenge, not yet. Just protection for what was rightfully mine. I went through every line carefully, something he'd never done in his life. The business had grown too large, too fast, and all of it was still registered under my address. It meant that legally, I was still part of it, whether he realized it or not. I went to see my lawyer and asked him to draft a quiet change, a family trust. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal. It would hold my part of the business and protect me in case my son ever made bad choices. My lawyer warned me. He'll need to sign these too. I said, he always does. When I brought the documents home, he didn't even ask what they were. He signed them while talking on the phone, his signature messy from multitasking. I told him they were just maintenance forms for tax purposes, routine filings that kept the company records current. He nodded without reading a single page. Pride always makes people blind. He left the papers on the table, kissed my forehead out of habit, and left for another meeting. I watched him go, the pen still warm from his hand. He had just signed over partial ownership of his company to a trust in my name. Half of everything he'd built now legally belonged to me. He didn't even know. I didn't do it to hurt him. At first, it was only to protect the legacy of his father. I wanted to make sure the family name wouldn't be dragged through the mud if he ever made a wrong move. But as months passed, I saw him changing more and more. He became colder, sharper, crueler. He started treating people like tools, not humans. Even me. The son I'd raised to be kind now spoke to me like I was beneath him. Every time he called me useless, every time he ignored my voice, the pen marks on those papers became louder. They weren't revenge. They were reality waiting to be revealed. Over the next few months, more documents came. More updates, more filings. Each time he signed without reading. Each time my share grew stronger and more protected. The trust became the quiet wall between his arrogance and my peace. I never changed the name of the company, never altered his title. Outwardly, it was all his. But behind the scenes, the law told a different story. I never bragged about it. I never even thought of using it. I just let the papers sit in my safe, sealed and untouched. I watched him travel, buy cars, give interviews. He liked to say he built everything alone. I let him. It's easy to let someone lie when you already know the truth. Sometimes silence feels like mercy. One day, he called asking me to sign another set of forms. He sounded impatient. I went through them again carefully, added what needed to be added, and placed them in front of him. He signed as always. You really should hire an assistant, I said softly. He laughed and said, "That's what you're for." I smiled. He didn't notice the sadness behind it. The papers he'd just signed gave me the final authority to approve any major company decision if something ever happened to him. He didn't even look. When he left that day, I sat at the table for a long time. The pen lay next to the folder, quiet and powerful. It had written both our futures without him realizing it. That's the thing about arrogance. It writes its own downfall. I didn't plan to destroy him. I just made sure that when he finally fell, he would land on the truth he had ignored. And my name would already be written beneath it. It began slowly, the way most downfalls do. First came the missed calls, then the strange silence around his business. People who used to speak about him with respect now spoke with uncertainty. I started hearing small things through neighbors, old friends, and news articles online. Nothing major at first, just whispers. A delayed payment here, a canceled shipment there, a contract under dispute. I never asked him about it. He never called to explain. Pride always hides the storm until it's too late. I watched from a distance, quiet, steady, unbothered. I baked my bread, watered my plants, swept my porch, and listened to the sound of his empire cracking. His company had grown too fast, too wide, too confident. When he first began, every deal went through my address, every document under my trust. Now, his new investors didn't even know that the woman who used to cook his breakfast still held silent power over every building, every truck, every cent that carried his company's name. He had forgotten me completely, but the law hadn't. His arrogance was built on the foundation I quietly owned. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just watched life start to move in circles, the way it always does when people forget their roots. The first official sign came when his assistant called me by mistake. She had been trying to reach the old legal office that still had my contact number listed. She said something about an audit, unpaid vendors, missing permits. Her voice sounded nervous, rushed. I listened without saying a word. When she realized her mistake, she hung up quickly. That was when I knew the fall had begun. I didn't feel joy. I felt inevitability. Days later, the news started to mention his company by name. Minor irregularities, they called it. Temporary setbacks. I read every article carefully. Behind the polite business language, I could hear the truth. They were sinking. Too many expenses, not enough profit. Too many promises, not enough integrity. I sat by the window that evening, holding my cup of tea, watching the sky turn gray. I thought about all the years I had spent worrying for him, praying for him, helping him. Now I didn't feel worry. I felt distance. Sometimes life takes your heart out of the fire just to show you how warm peace can be. He came home less often, but when he did, I could see the panic behind his confidence. He talked louder, moved faster, bragged harder. That's what people do when they start losing control. They shout to hide the cracks. He spoke about new investors, expansion plans, and global branches, but his eyes told another story. He was drowning, and he didn't even know how deep the water had become. I stayed silent. I served his coffee, nodded, and listened to him lie to himself. The silence between us wasn't revenge anymore. It was a mirror. Soon, people began showing up at my door. Lawyers, messengers, accountants, all asking for signatures, documents, or clarifications. They didn't know who I was. They just knew the paperwork still led back to me. I sent them away politely. "Tell him to handle it," I said, because that's what he wanted. Independence. So I gave it to him. Completely. The following week, I saw the first sign of collapse in the newspaper. A small headline tucked in the corner of the business section. Internal disputes delay major contract. I folded the page neatly and set it aside. I didn't show anyone. There was no reason to. The same son who once told me I was useless had finally built something that no one could fix, not even him. Each night I went to bed knowing I didn't need to lift a finger. Pride was doing the work for me. The same pride that made him call me useless was now eating everything he had built, piece by piece. I didn't need to interfere. I just needed to wait for gravity to do its job. By the end of that month, the whispers had become storms. Employees were leaving, investors were withdrawing, and the same people who once praised him now refused to take his calls. I watched it all unfold with quiet eyes. I didn't celebrate. I didn't curse him either. I just whispered to myself, now he'll understand. Because sometimes lessons don't come through words or punishment. They come through silence, patience, and the slow fall of arrogance meeting reality. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It came in pieces like a slow storm that pretends to pass but never really leaves. That week, the news turned from whispers to headlines. Every channel spoke about his company, the one he had once called indestructible. Major supply chain firm under investigation, one article said. Investors withdraw after audit exposure, another headline read. I didn't have to look for it. It was everywhere. His face was on the screen, his name under words like failure, loss, and liability. I sat at the kitchen table reading the paper in silence. My tea grew cold, but I didn't move. There was no satisfaction in watching your own child fall apart, only a quiet understanding that life had come full circle. He came to see me that afternoon. The sound of his car outside broke months of silence. When I opened the door, I saw a man who no longer looked like my son. Tired eyes, unshaven face, and a tremble in his voice when he said my name. He sat at the table he once called small and outdated. His hands shook when he tried to pour his coffee. He told me the company was collapsing. Lawsuits, debts, angry partners, missing funds. His voice cracked when he said, I don't know what to do. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, the same way I did when he was a boy who broke something and waited for me to fix it. The only difference now was that I didn't move to clean up his mess. He asked me to help him, not with advice, not with comfort, with money. He wanted me to sign an emergency loan as guarantor. He said if I signed, he could save the company. He said it was the only way. I looked at the paper he placed in front of me. The words were clear. It wasn't just a loan, it was a trap that would tie me to his debts forever. He didn't read it carefully, but I did. Old habits don't fade. I placed the paper back in front of him and said quietly, This isn't mine to sign. He frowned, confused, desperate. He said, It's my company, Mom. I nodded slowly and said, Yes, and mine. He didn't understand at first. He stared at me, not processing what I meant. I stood, walked to the small drawer near the kitchen counter, and took out the folder I'd kept sealed for over a year. I placed it beside his papers. Your company still uses my address, I said softly. And my trust holds half of it. He froze. His face went pale. He flipped through the documents, his hands trembling as he read his own signatures, the ones he never remembered writing. The room fell quiet. He finally looked up. Realization spreading across his face like a slow fire. Every lie he had believed about ownership, control, and independence shattered right there between us. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just said, You built it with my name under it. You forgot, but the law didn't. He leaned back, speechless. His confidence had finally met something it couldn't talk its way around. The truth. I didn't tell him that I had already been contacted by his creditors, that I had already decided what would happen next. He didn't deserve that part of the story yet. That night when he left, he didn't say goodbye. He walked out the same way he always did, but slower this time, like a man carrying the weight of his own arrogance. I watched him from the window. His car lights faded into the dark, and for the first time I didn't worry. Because the fall wasn't mine to stop, it was his to feel. The next morning, the front page carried the headline, Major Company Files for Bankruptcy, CEO Under Investigation. His name was right there, bold and broken. I folded the newspaper neatly and placed it beside the old contract folder. The same papers that gave him power had now brought him to his knees. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just sat on my porch with my cup of tea, breathing in the morning air. Sometimes justice doesn't come from anger. It comes from patience, from letting people walk far enough to meet their own mistakes. And in that quiet, I realized the truth. I didn't ruin him. I just stopped saving him. 2 days later, the calls started coming, first from lawyers, then from banks, and finally from reporters. They all wanted one thing: answers. His company had officially collapsed, and the court was beginning the process of liquidation. My name had appeared in the paperwork, not as a witness this time, but as a co-owner. I didn't need to say a word. The truth had already spoken for me through signatures he never cared to read. The lawyer handling the case called me Madam. He sounded nervous, respectful, the way people speak when they realize they've underestimated someone. He explained that half of the company's ownership and all decision-making rights now traced directly back to me through the trust. My son hadn't told anyone about it because he didn't know it existed. Every asset, every remaining property, every legal decision now needed my approval. I thanked the lawyer and hung up. Then I sat quietly, letting the weight of it all settle. For the first time in years, silence didn't hurt. It felt earned. By evening, my son came rushing to the house. He looked broken. The expensive suit wrinkled, his tie undone, his confidence gone. He asked if it was true. I didn't answer right away. He said his lawyer had called, that everyone was confused. He couldn't understand how I had become part of the company's ownership. I told him the truth. I hadn't taken anything from him. He had given it to me himself. Every time he had thrown a folder in front of me to sign, every time he had rolled his eyes at boring paperwork, every time he had assumed I was too old to understand. He had handed me control without knowing it. He didn't believe me at first. He shouted, demanded proof. I handed him the trust documents, neatly sealed and dated. His own signature was there on every page. He stared at it in disbelief, shaking his head. I didn't speak. There was no need to. He sank into the chair across from me. His hands pressed against his forehead. I watched him breathe heavily, trying to process what he'd done. He had always been the man who thought he could control every situation, talk his way out of every consequence. Now, he sat there defeated by his own carelessness. I didn't feel proud. I just felt quiet. Mothers don't celebrate their children's pain, even when it's deserved. I only wished he had learned humility before life forced it on him. The next day, I met with the lawyers to finalize the process. They laid out everything clearly. The assets, the debts, the remaining funds. They said the liquidation couldn't proceed without my approval. The board couldn't act without my signature. The creditors couldn't touch the property until I decided. In one afternoon, the same useless old woman he had mocked had become the one person standing between him and whatever future he had left. Every headline now carried his downfall, but every legal document carried my name. When I returned home, I sat on the porch for a long time. I thought about the years of silence, the sacrifices, the tears I never showed. I had once prayed for him to succeed, and now I prayed for him to understand. There's a difference between earning success and inheriting it. He never learned that difference. He thought power came from shouting louder, climbing faster, owning more, but real power is quiet. It hides in patience, in kindness mistaken for weakness, in signatures written with steady hands. The next morning, the lawyer called again. "They can't proceed without you," he said. "You're the deciding vote." I thanked him and hung up. I didn't rush to decide. I wanted him to wait, not for cruelty, but for reflection. I wanted him to sit in the silence he had once given me. He had ignored my calls, ignored my voice, ignored my worth. Now, the world was forcing him to wait for mine. That night, as I looked at the trust papers one last time, I realized how life had come back to balance. He called me useless, but the world had written a different title beside my name. Owner. I didn't destroy him. I didn't even try. I just stayed still long enough for truth to catch up to him. The woman he dismissed at breakfast had become the one who owned every piece of what he lost by dinner. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the same folder that had changed everything. The papers were spread neatly in front of me, every signature, every date, every decision I had made printed in black ink. The lawyers were waiting for my final answer, whether I would save what was left of his company or let it fall. I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up sewing his school uniforms, the meals I skipped so he could eat, the land I sold so he could dream. I thought about every sacrifice that had built the same company that now lay in ruins. I realized I didn't want to destroy him, but I also couldn't save what pride had already burned. Some lessons can't be learned through comfort. They need loss. And this was his turn to lose. The next morning I called the lawyer. My voice was calm. I said, "We will proceed with liquidation." He hesitated, asked if I was certain. I told him yes. The workers would be paid first, not the board, not the investors, not my son. The people who showed up every day to build something that wasn't theirs deserved more than those who ran it into the ground. I gave them priority. I refused to bail out greed. I refused to fund arrogance. The company had made millions once, but it had also buried integrity along the way. I wasn't going to keep it alive just to feed his ego again. The lawyer said the decision would make headlines. I told him that was fine. I wasn't afraid of noise. I had lived most of my life in silence. He said my son might never forgive me. I told him forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who never apologized. I wanted peace, not permission. I signed the papers, each one a quiet goodbye to the years I had spent cleaning up his mistakes. When it was done, I placed the pen down slowly and said, "Pay them well. End it clean." That evening, the story broke. Parent shareholder orders full liquidation of collapsed company. My phone started ringing nonstop. I didn't answer any of them. I sat by the window instead, watching the rain fall on the garden outside. The earth looked calm, even while breaking apart. There was something beautiful about that. Destruction isn't always anger. Sometimes it's renewal. The next day, I received messages from former employees. Some thanked me for paying them first, saying no one else ever cared enough to do that. I replied simply, "You earned it." Others wrote how shocked they were to learn my name was behind everything. I didn't reply to those. I didn't need to explain myself. The truth didn't need decoration. It just needed to exist. When my son called, his voice was quiet, almost unfamiliar. He didn't shout, didn't beg. He just asked why I didn't help, why I didn't stop it, why I let it fall. I listened, letting his words tremble in the air. When he finished, I said, "I didn't let it fall. You did." I told him that arrogance is like fire. It warms you at first, but if you hold it too long, it burns everything you love. He said nothing after that. Just silence. And for once, that silence didn't hurt. It felt like understanding finally arriving late, but not too late to matter. Over the next few weeks, the liquidation continued. The assets were sold, the debts cleared, the workers paid. My lawyer called it strategic closure. I called it balance. Everything he had once used to show off, the cars, the offices, the equipment, all gone. But something more important had been built in its place: humility. At night, I would sit outside and look at the empty sky, thinking about how strange it was that justice can feel so calm. There was no joy in it, no revenge, only truth. My husband used to say, "Sometimes to save a person, you have to let what they love die first." Now I understood what he meant. The company wasn't mine anymore, but the peace was. I had given my son everything once. This time, I gave him something better: the chance to rebuild himself without lies. It was 3 months after the liquidation when I heard the knock on my door. It was slow, hesitant, not the kind of knock that demanded entry, but the kind that asked for forgiveness. I knew who it was before I even opened it. When I did, he was standing there, not as the confident man who used to fill my kitchen with loud words and bigger pride, but as someone smaller, tired, quiet, uncertain. He looked thinner. His clothes were plain. His shoes scuffed, his eyes heavy with something I hadn't seen in years: humility. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. He just stood there, holding his breath like a child, waiting to see if his mother would still let him in. I stepped aside and nodded. He walked in without a word. The house looked the same as when he left it years ago. The same table, the same chair, the same photographs on the wall, only he had changed. He sat down slowly, looking around like the memories were too loud to ignore. I could see the shame sitting on his shoulders, heavier than any debt he ever owed. He rubbed his hands together and said softly, "You let it all go." His voice cracked halfway through. I didn't answer. I just poured him tea, the same way I used to when he was young and scared to admit his mistakes. He looked down at the cup for a long time before whispering, "I don't understand why." He wanted to believe I had done it out of anger, but I hadn't. Anger fades. Lessons last. I told him that nothing in this world truly collapses. It just changes form. The company was gone, yes, but something else had begun. He looked confused, so I told him the truth in the simple words. "You thought you built everything alone. Now you can see what happens when arrogance becomes your foundation. It cracks. And when it does, the truth always walks through the door." He looked away, ashamed, unable to meet my eyes. I could see he wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he was young, busy, distracted, but he didn't. For the first time in years, he listened. He stayed quiet for a while, then finally asked if I hated him. I told him no. Hate is a waste of energy, and I'd already wasted enough years hoping he would see me. What I felt now wasn't hate. It was distance, but a peaceful one. I didn't need revenge to make peace. I just needed truth to exist. He asked if I regretted letting it all go. I told him I didn't. What's the use of saving something that was already rotten inside? Sometimes you must burn a house to build a home again. He didn't speak after that. His eyes said everything. Regret, loss, maybe understanding. When he finished his tea, he stood up to leave. But before he did, he walked to the table where the old company folder used to sit. He stared at the empty space for a while, then turned to me and said quietly, "I don't deserve forgiveness," I said, "then earn it." He nodded slowly, his eyes glassy with the kind of pain that comes from realizing how far you've fallen. He thanked me for letting him in and walked to the door. I watched him go, just as I had watched him leave so many times before, but this time was different. This time he left without pride. After he was gone, I sat back down and looked at the empty chair across from me. For the first time, it didn't hurt to see it empty. I knew he would return again, maybe not soon, but someday. Life has a way of bringing people back to the places they broke, just so they can rebuild. I didn't need an apology, I didn't need tears, I just needed time. And now he had it too. The same quiet time I once used to find my strength. That night I closed the door, turned off the lights, and smiled faintly to myself. The world had gone in a full circle. The son who once mocked my silence now lived inside it. The man who once called me useless had come back to the only place that still opened its door. He didn't come home to ask for help this time. He came home to understand. The morning after he left, the house felt quiet, but not the same kind of quiet it used to hold. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of peace. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup of tea, the same spot where years of pain had begun and ended. The newspaper lay folded beside me. His name was still in the headlines, but this time it wasn't surrounded by words like failure or collapse. It was an article about how he had stepped down publicly, how he had apologized to his employees, and how he planned to rebuild from nothing. I read every word slowly. Not out of pride, but out of something softer. Relief. Sometimes falling isn't punishment, it's correction. I looked around the small house. The same walls that once echoed with laughter, the same pictures that held frozen smiles from better days. Everything here had aged, just like me, but it had survived. So had I. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think of myself as a victim of his arrogance. I was the reminder that everything borrowed must one day return. Respect, love, truth. What goes unseen doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to be seen again. He had called me useless, but those words no longer lived in me. They had lost their weight. They were just noise that time had carried away. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers that morning at the breakfast table, the moment those words left his mouth careless and sharp. I don't think he does, but I do. And I'm glad I never shouted back. My silence spoke louder than anger ever could. Anger is temporary. Silence leaves echoes. My silence had turned into his lesson. It had followed him into boardrooms, through headlines, and finally to my doorstep. And when he stood there, empty-handed and humbled, it was that same silence that welcomed him in. I never wanted revenge. I never wanted to see him fail. I only wanted him to remember, to understand that success built without gratitude always collapses, no matter how high it climbs. He learned it the hard way, but at least he learned. People often think strength is in shouting, in proving a point. But real strength is quiet. It's in the patience to let truth work on its own. It's in letting life show what words can't. Now, when I read the business section of the newspaper, I still see his name sometimes. Not in bold letters, not in scandals or speeches, just quietly mentioned among small startups rebuilding from scratch. I fold the paper, sip my tea, and smile. He's learning what real work feels like, what humility builds, what respect costs. And maybe one day he'll come back again, not as a son who failed, but as a man who finally understands what success truly means. In the evenings, I sit by the window and watch the sky change colors. The sun always sets, but it always rises again too. That's how I see him now. Not as the man who broke my heart, but as someone still finding his light. The company that once carried his name is gone, but the lesson it left behind remains. It taught both of us something that no amount of money could buy. That power fades, but character stays. Sometimes, I still hear his words in my head. You're just a useless old woman. They no longer hurt. They remind me of where I started and how far I've come. Because in the end, I wasn't useless. I was patient. I was steady. I was the quiet backbone that never needed recognition. And when life finally turned, it showed who was truly strong. Now, when people talk about his downfall, I don't correct them. I just say, he'll rise again. He's my son. Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means you've made peace with the truth. And the truth is simple. The company still carries his name, but the foundation that built it and the ashes it left behind both belong to me. I sip my tea every morning with that same calm smile, not from pride, but from peace, because I know I didn't destroy him. I rebuilt myself. And that is something no one can take away.